Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We're very honored to have Betty Tapias-Heinrich with us today. She is the Language Services Coordinator at Robbinsdale Area Schools. She is also an instructor in the program for translators and interpreters at the University of Minnesota and has been recognized as a distinguished educator in her field. Thank you for joining us, Betty.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we are all dealing with the pandemic and with COVID-19, I wanted to ask you, what are the lessons learned from your perspective on dealing with the pandemic, and how do you suggest organizations in the field of education handle this to be better prepared to provide language access? What are the lessons learned?
Sure. Several. The pressure of a pandemic or any emergency situation can really highlight an organization's preparedness to provide language access services, or maybe their lack of preparedness to do it. So training and level of skill and your preparedness level can really impact the quality of a written translation or an oral interpretation. So it's really important also to have a clear process in place so people know how to access language services. And if they don't, and if it's not well promoted or publicized, it can lead to a lot of lost time and confused messages, because sometimes staff can be called upon to do translations or interpreting without the proper training. And so that is a very important issue to have taken care of in advance. Also, having a well-trained team and knowing who to call on for additional support, like agency interpreters or contract translators and interpreters, is really important to have in place before the emergency situations arise. Because after the fact, it can be very difficult because those people will be very busy very quickly, and it can be hard to find people. Because of the pandemic, a lot of communication went out to families in written form. And in order to ensure that translations are provided in an efficient and timely manner, the English text needs to get to the translators with enough lead time so that they can produce the document in another language. And it's also really important to have someone who can edit and review the translations once they're done. Another thing is that, tools such as Google Translate are commonly used to translate text really quickly in a pinch. But the use of this tool during the pandemic really highlighted inaccuracies in translating messages that have more levels of complexity or educational context in them. And we found that a tool like that is more useful for simple messages. In fact, federal guidelines state that if we use this type of tool in the education field, a trained translator needs to review the translation to verify it for accuracy and make any corrections if needed. And as research has shown, and our staff also experienced, it's that it can often take longer to correct a poorly written translation than to have done the translation ourselves in the first place. We also discovered that setting up meetings and becoming familiar with new platforms takes time. And many of our students and families had never used tools like Zoom or Google Meet before. And step-by-step instructions were needed to help them know how to use these services, and frequently needed more than once.
Well, that's wonderful. We had a very interesting development, right? Schools went remote overnight, and even kids and parents that spoke fluent English were disoriented. I'm a parent, yes. 3 kids. And especially my youngest daughter, who is in the elementary education, we were completely disoriented how to function. All of the instructions moved online right away.
Yes.
Did you did you have to come up with some new solutions possibly to help parents who are limited English proficiency and help kids who are limited English proficiency to be able to even access, the educational materials?
Well, certainly there were many phone calls. We had to have people ready to call and help families if we found that there were issues. We had to have many documents translated with instructions on how to use all of the different platforms, the different links, the different services that were available online to families. And another thing that was important is that we had already in place a glossary for Spanish, because Spanish is by far our largest language. And we've been working to build that up. And we'd been sharing that for several years with other staff so that they were able to know how to use some of those less common terms and just be consistent with their language. So there are many ways to say some things. And sometimes it's things can be really complicated too, to try to find the right way to say it. And it just allows everyone to quickly access those terms and be consistent.
Do you think any of the solutions that you came up with, any of the new solutions, are they here to stay long term now within your organization?
Yes, I think one of the things it really highlighted is that having the basics down in your organization, if you have a good base, then you can really build on that. And things like training, have people that are trained and know how to use the tools and know about language access are really important. One thing that we had that's kind of new, but we're going to continue to develop, is a translation consistency guide that we use to further provide consistency in our translation in things regarding, formatting and style, because when everything is online, you're either in a video or you're calling people, or it's in written form where people have to be able to read it. And we found that to be very helpful in sharing internally with those who are working with documents and even with the agencies that support us.
Did you feel that the pandemic has hindered language access in any way, or within your experience, did the limited English proficiency families, and that includes deaf and hard of hearing people, do you feel that you were able to maintain the same level of language access?
Well, I don't know that it's the same level. Let's see. We had to change so quickly. There was a time of adjustment, certainly, where we were trying to figure out how we were going to reach everybody, what the best way was. Even the teachers were trying to figure out, how they were going to provide lessons online. And thankfully, our district had already been in that process, so it wasn't as much of a change for us as it was maybe for other school districts. I know that there are federal guidelines for spoken language interpreters, and the deaf and hard of hearing community have more existing supports in place than spoken language access has at the moment. But our state is one of the few states that has a code of ethics and standards of practice for educational interpreters of spoken languages. And because of this, a national effort has also begun now to develop one at the national level. I think that that is going to help a lot in language access in terms of consistency for families moving from state to state, or just everybody being on the same page and knowing what's expected and how to do things. Sometimes bilingual staff are still called upon to do the work of an interpreter and a translator. And those of us who work in the field know that while it looks to be, very easy to do, it's something that requires training and something that requires internalization and time to learn. It's not something that you just automatically know. There are a whole set of skills that you need to learn and develop before you can actually go and do that job well.
And how do you think the code of ethics, if you were talking to like other states and educational interpreters and educators and school districts in other states, how do you believe the codes of ethics and standards of practice for educational interpreters can help? Why is it important to roll it out nationwide?
It's important because not every state has one. And what that leads to or can lead to is confusion in terms of people knowing what their roles are, knowing how to perform that role. Maybe people might be stepping out of their role more than they should and speaking for others instead of as they were that person. They might be interjecting their own opinions or omitting things that if everybody there spoke English, everybody would have understood. They would have heard it. So it's really important so that people will understand what's expected of them, and then we'll have some guidelines as to how to actually do the job.
What are some of the biggest challenges that educational interpreters face? I'm sure you have experience in the field and you have worked, within different settings. What would you say is the biggest challenge professionally for educational interpreters?
One thing, and not just for educational interpreters, I think this goes a little more broad, is just the need to have more organization, more professionalization of the field. In education, it's very important that more school staff and administrators understand what the role of the interpreter is so that they can effectively utilize interpreters and translators. Certainly, training needs to be more available, and also maybe required so that the issues of language access or lack of language access can be slowly eliminated, or maybe more quickly. I think if we had more trained people, more training programs in place, more than just the bare minimum, then families and staff would have a lot better language access. They'd be able to communicate much better.
Right. And, if I'm a parent and I have a textbook, and even if the curriculum is elementary school, it does not mean that I can go in class. And even if I read the chapter taught, but I have no background as a teacher, it doesn't mean I can go and teach that curriculum to the kids effectively, right? So
that's right.
There's training as an educator, and the same thing goes for interpreters. Just because you speak a language doesn't mean you can interpret.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even, just because you're a teacher, if you teach math doesn't mean you can go and effectively teach the art class or the English class. It goes, it's the same thing just within the teaching field.
Right. So do you see that the COVID-19 outbreak and the pandemic and the sudden need to basically change everything, right? And the way we deliver education and the way we communicate, how do you think that changed the role of the educational interpreter, at least within your organization, or somehow highlighted the role of the interpreter?
Well, I think the role is still the same. Where it was different is that interpreters had to quickly learn how to use all these platforms, learn how to interpret remotely if they hadn't already been doing it. And I think some were maybe surprised to learn that technology has improved and that it's somewhat easier now, or better if you have a good internet connection, and those are improving as well. So I think it's important to learn how to work with these new technologies, especially in light of emergencies like the COVID pandemic, so that we can offer the best language access possible to families, whether it be just on the telephone or with video remote interpreting.
And how much of a role do you think technology will play in tomorrow's world of educational interpreting?
I think it's going to play a very big role, especially now because of the pandemic, it suddenly had to play a huge role, where before there in education, there were a lot more in-person meetings, and now we had to move all that to video or just over the phone. And things like you're teaching families how to use the different platforms, helping them know that we're probably going to be getting a Google Voice phone number. We're not going to be calling you from the office, to be watching for different phone numbers even. It was a big learning curve for everybody. But incidentally, because of this, a guide was developed during the pandemic by one of the work groups of the Interpreting and Translation in Education. And it's called Remote Interpreting in Educational Settings, Best Practice Recommendations. So that would be a good guide to help interpreters know, like, what are the things they have to have ready? How do they prepare for different situations? Because technology is going to continue to advance, and it's really important to become aware of how to use that technology to improve our practice.
Wonderful. And is that guide available online today?
It is available. I'm fairly certain it's easily accessible. It was sent to me in an email, and I'm hoping people should be able to, I'm thinking they should be able to Google it, because it was meant to be widely distributed.
We will look up the link, and then we'll share it as part of the podcast, so that
Sure.
it can reach more educational interpreters, because I think it's a great thing that happened, and it's very, very important, and it's going to help a lot of people.
Yes.
Okay, so then my last question is how can schools provide better support to interpreters? What would be your advice to schools at this time?
My advice to schools is to make sure that if you already have interpreters on staff that don't have the training, to find a way for them to get that training. So, because they will notice a big difference between someone who is trained and someone who is not in terms of language access. We have a duty to provide, to ensure language access to families, and we can't do it if we don't know how to do it. And if you're in the process of hiring new interpreters, make sure that you're hiring people who have had training. And the more training the person has had, especially at the college or university level, that's going to be much better for your organization.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.